Hello, Anthony, and congratulations on winning the 11-second club, which I think you've won at least one time before. So congratulations on that. This is a really nice shot, and I enjoyed looking at it. Let me introduce myself real quick. My name is Kevin Koch. I pronounce it Cook, but it's spelled K-O-C-H. I'm the Animation Supervisor at lovely Moonbot Studios in picturesque Shreveport, Louisiana, which I've been doing for going on 2 years now. Prior to that, I worked at DreamWorks, Blue Sky, Warner Brothers, Sony, Rhythm and Hughes, PSYOP, a couple of other places, and on 13 feature films, I think, a couple of proposed feature films, a bunch of short films, some theme park ride projects, cinematics, games, apps. Been there, done that, and have enjoyed most of it, fortunately. I also started my career in hand-drawn animation, but I've been exclusively doing, or almost exclusively doing, CG work for the last, I don't know, 10 or 11 years, 12 years, something like that. And I've been a mentor for, is this my 8th year? It's been a while. At least 8 years, I think, with Animation Mentor. And I think this is my 3rd guest critique here at 11-second Club. So I've been around the block a few times and still plugging away. When I started to get ready to do this critique, I kept asking myself, why is this name familiar? Anthony Traviaso. And then I remembered we worked together. I was at Blue Sky, and you came in at the end of Rio. I think you were slated to start on the next Ice Age movie, and I was finishing up on Rio. So it's good to see you again, and good to see you doing such great work. So anyway, wonder if you're still into ping pong as much as you were. I remember that was your passion at the time, aside from animation. So let's jump into this. It's a really well executed piece. Your lighting and rendering and all that helps. It's clearly mature work, or the work of a mature animator. Well thought through, well acted, effective. It's just overall a really nice job. And I think there's a lot of restraint and excellent, subtle kind of detail that you've put in here that makes it work really well. My biggest quibble with it, I think, and this is partly coming back to the first time I looked at it, when I first was just going through and just, what's the winning entry look like, what's the next one, and kind of just running through. My thought at the time was it's not clear to me whether to what extent the woman has been a participant in this. And the more I watch it, the more that doesn't bother me as much. But when I first watched it, my impression was that, that this guy had really forced himself on her, and that she was kind of revulsed by him, but not really, and that her acting wasn't as acute as it could have been in a few places. Watching it again a few times over, I now look at it that I think you were going for the idea that she has mixed feelings and he's just a real scumbag, and she does have some attraction and she has some revulsion, and something's just gone on between them that she's embarrassed and humiliated by, but that she wasn't a total victim in this. So I guess I just want to say I think that aspect of this, and that's a really hard, subtle thing to pull off, but it wasn't as clear, I think, as it could have been what's going on inside her head. There are times when she seems remarkably calm and thoughtful, like she's not really that distressed. She's just kind of a little worried that he's going to say something he shouldn't. And there are other times in this piece where she feels really bothered. And so I think there's some just subtle mismatches in the tone of her performance. I'll point some of those out. Let's go ahead and watch it. I should have done that right from the start, but let's watch the whole thing through.
You won't tell him, will you?
I don't know. I'm going to have to think about this. But you'll find out one way or the other.
You won't.
So, right in here, as she's just, you know, it feels to me like he's kissing her and she's letting him and she's not looking really bothered, that she's experiencing pangs of regret. You know, it's easy to imagine that she has a boyfriend or a husband and she's cheated and you know, she's has mixed feelings about it, obviously, but she's been a participant in this. And she continues to feel like through here as if she is kind of thoughtful about it, but you know, the level of regret is not that extreme. And then in here she starts to get these faces like she's really grossed out by him, that she just really can't stand him. But that's in her facial expression. Her body, there's not the kind of pulling away from him that really goes with the facial expression. And even here, as he's giving her some space, she turns into him and puts her hand on his chest. And I think I would have liked to have seen a little an expression that was consistent with kind of mixed feelings here, like I shouldn't be doing this, but I can't stop myself. And instead, it feels like, you know, her reading her face, it's saying one message, watching her behavior, it's saying another, but in a way that's not as clear, I think, as well defined as it could be. And you know, here when he kisses her, it's like, I assume they've been kissing for a while. So her eyes get really big and she kind of pulls back, but she doesn't really, you know, and then it's like, ooh, this is gross. You know, this is where, in particular, I was sort of, I either would have wanted to see her at first kind of like, oh, and then kind of giving into it, like, oh yeah, this is, you know, I'm kind of a rat too. Or when he comes in for the kiss, her really like, oh, enough, I've made a decision, you know, I've got to get away from this. But it remains a little bit too ambiguous, I think, for my taste. And, you know, it may well just be my taste on that. So that's kind of my acting thoughts. I think for him, he kind of hits one note here, and you really milk this one expression with the, you know, what a lot of people sometimes refer to as the DreamWorks brow, which you're not really quite doing, but, you know, the high brow there and low, and this eye really wide. And I think you kind of, that's kind of his one note in that section, and it feels a little pushed, and, you know, it's really hard to keep your eye bugged open like that for that long. So that part of his performance feels a little more cartoony than it needs to be, and a little bit at odds with the rest of the performance. Otherwise, I think you know, the acting is, you know, you've pulled off a good job, and you've just kind of gotten into a little bit of no man's land, I think, with a little bit of the clarity of what we should think about her. So now let me get in and point out some of the technical, the more, you know, the animation minutiae that I think for the most part you've handled really well, but some of the stuff that I think could be handled at least differently and maybe better. One is, let me start on him, because I think there's less to talk about there. I think there's a lot more subtle acting ideas in her performance, and so let's hold off on that for a second. So right in here, you're doing some really nice subtle stuff. You've got a lot of great stuff going on. His nose, pushes against her neck a little bit. You're not overdoing the kissing. The way he, it does feel kind of tender. He pauses here, and you highlight, in a subtle way, that he's doing some thinking. He's furrowing his brow. He opens his eyes. He's basically kind of waking up. He's really paying attention, and then he, kind of does that squint and comes out. I like all that a lot. I think that's great. Then as he pulls up, though, you push him into this a little bit more cartooniness than I think is called for. You have a lot of drag and overlap on his jaw, and you punch him right into, like, this eye pops open right there and stays really bugged out all through here. Actually, kind of relax it a bit, and then you really push it. And, as I already mentioned, I think holding that for so long, and he's kind of thinking. You have this one little eye dart here. Actually, I think the natural tendency at this point is to be looking at her. So I think that's fine, and I think you've done a nice job of staging the shadows on their faces to work with this. I think you could have knocked down the floppiness of his jaw a little bit, and I think you could have hit this pose here on his eyes and then relaxed it by about 50% or so. And just he doesn't need to be he's like, I'm going to think about it, then let's let him just look like he's thinking a little bit instead of trying to strike a pose that no one, she can't even see his face.
Oh.
I think as he starts to do these eye darts and you relax his eyes a little bit, this is what I'm talking about. I think if you'd gone into this mode a little bit sooner, like right after he kind of hits, he kind of lifts up, I don't know, and then you relaxed him into that at this, by frame 96, I think I would be fine with it. Then there are some places where you're doing a nice job. Like, it's kind of interesting the way he hugs into her face, and you actually kind of swing his jaw around and conform this to her. But what I think is kind of missing, both when he presses into her and when he pulls away, is it has no effect on her. If we took him out of the scene, I mean, there's a little bit of a lean of her head here, but like as he's smearing this and really pushing her cheek, you're selling, like right at this moment, you're really selling that these faces are shoved together. But then as he pulls away from her, right here, there's no effect. Like if he's like leaning into her when the pressure's off, she's not going to be like, she's going to tend to rebound a little bit back towards him. And likewise here, I think a little bit more when he presses his face in on her, they just kind of ease into each other a little bit. And I think now this is kind of shifting to her performance, but I think his effect, I mean, he's a big muscular guy. He shoves his big face into her face. I think we could have gotten a little more sharpness in there of him kind of going into her. It's, watching her eyes, I think as his face hits hers, there would have been more of a squint, a little bit of a jolt in the overall head translate, maybe a little bit of twisting away, and then I think do all that, and then she kind of gives in to the kiss. Then you'd have somewhere to go. There'd be some progression of her reaction to what's happening. I think there's a relative lack of reaction to that action. So let's see. So I think just a little bit a little bit too much cartooniness on his part, and her reaction to some of his stuff, of his behaviors, could have been pushed a little bit. I think shifting gears now to her, in her overall performance, she has her clavicles up really in a very pronounced way throughout this. And it's one thing when he's kissing and she's kind of like, pulling up like that, and I kind of like it and I kind of don't like that. When he pulls away from her, I think you could have had her, as he pulls away, relax her shoulders a bit. And I think it would have been really nice to see this shoulder, his hand's there, and she relaxes and that hand relaxes with it. And then when she spins toward, as he scrunches into her, and then we feel the shoulders come up again. I think the contrast between this pose and backing up, backing down to here, pushing this down, I think you have some change there, but I think you could have gone further with that. So, shoulders up here, relax them through here, and then let him really kind of squeeze her together, her clavicles together. And then as he pulls away, her clavicles are late reacting. It's like as soon as he backs off, there's going to be a drop. It's sort of like pulls away and then a slight delayed reaction. It's not a big deal. I think a lot of people wouldn't particularly notice it, but I think it could have enriched the overall authenticity of her performance a little bit. Okay, let me shift now to really taking a look at her facial performance, which is full of some great poses and great nuance, but a few things that I think, a few aspects that catch my eye. In general, I think there's some things going on with her eye darts, eye direction, eyelids, and the interaction of her brows and her lids that could be spiffed up a little bit. There are a lot of animals, that have very different eyelid structures, and when we do certain things to the eyelids that human eyelids don't do, to me it always looks like, oh, that looks like a reptile kind of blink, or that looks like another kind of animal than a human being. The more you look at this stuff, the more you kind of see the basic rules, and little things really start to jump out at you. One thing that I've kind of trained myself to really notice is just the nature of blinks and the closure point of when we close our eyes, what lid, the upper or the lower, is doing what. And our upper lids do the vast majority of the action when we're doing eye darts, when we're blinking, when we're looking around. Our upper lids are doing most of the moving around. Our lower lids have a much smaller range of action, and they're relatively quieter. Not that they don't do anything, but they don't do much. For example, if you if you pin your upper lid open and blink, your lower lid on the blink doesn't go up and close. The lower lid's physically incapable of coming all the way up and doing the blink closure. Whereas if you pull the lower lid down a little bit and blink, the upper lid will go down even a little bit lower than it normally goes and try to close the gap. The result of all that is that when we relax, when we close our eyes and relax, we see much more upper lid than lower lid. And so when I see an eye socket like this, and the closure point of the lids is right in the middle, then it doesn't feel natural to me. And I think the closure point on these lids would feel much more natural if they were about there. Now, when we're kind of, when we're pushing our cheeks up for whatever reason, either we're really smiling or we're kind of like, giving that look some people can do very effectively, it will kind of push our lower lids higher than normal. But I'm not seeing that kind of stuff going on in her cheeks. And compounding this problem, I think, is that as he's doing this, you move both lids down further. So, and there's not that much movement of her brow and cheeks to justify this. So you have the closure point there, and then a moment later, I guess it's a little bit too fine to do a draw over, but we're actually seeing more lower lid than we're seeing upper lid right here. And then the eyes drift down together a little bit. If you would really squash the brows down a little bit more, then I think that movement would be justified. But it feels like this little line of her eyelashes is just kind of moving on its own. And there are a couple places where it does some odd stuff. Right here it does it again. There's really no change in her brows or her cheeks, but from like frame 18 to frame 22, the upper lid and the lower lid drop down further. Now there's a simple trick that a lot of people like to do when they do a blink and they have the lids closed for 2 or 3 frames. They will close the lids, and then on the second frame of closure they'll push a little bit further. Get a little bit of a squash sense. But this is with the eyes relaxed and closed, and it just feels weird. I don't think it's possible to do that physiologically. We can make this line of our eyelashes move around with our eyes closed if we do eye darts. If we're moving our eyes around a lot, then that little bulge of the eye, the anterior chamber, will cause this kind of ripple effect on the eyelids themselves, and we'll kind of see it in this line of the eyelashes. But in this case, where they're just kind of drifting down, it feels without any associated movement, any kind of squinting. If you push the cheeks up and the brow down and then changed that closure point, I think it would have been fine. And I'm really going on about this. I think in this kind of shot, it's a really big deal because this is where the audience is looking. The audience is always going to be trying to look at the character's eyes. And unless another character pops on screen, then we look at their eyes, or unless somebody starts waving something around and the faces aren't doing much. But even when there's a lot of action, we the audience are always looking at eyes, always looking at faces, and when we're looking at faces, we're almost always looking at the eyes. So we notice this stuff, and we spend hours a day looking at other real people's faces and eyes, and even if you don't realize why something doesn't quite feel right, I think we do sense it, even an untrained audience member. So I think it's important. And then right here, this move really kind of gets me. I think you're trying to keep the face loose, but we've got this. I feel these eyelids are moving up at frame 23, and this brow and this part of this brow are moving down. This eyelid doesn't seem to really be doing anything, and this part of the eyebrow isn't doing anything. So suddenly we have this differential movement. It feels like the one brow is doing something disconnected from the other, and the eyelids are almost going in opposite directions. And then you come out of that blink. And I think you were just trying to get some elasticity in the eye, because real human beings have these little fat pads, and there's a lot of stuff that goes on in here that most CG rigs don't have. And so we have to fake it. We have to exaggerate some things, use a little squash and stretch. And I think you were going for that, but to me, it's a briefly distracting moment where it's like, oh, something weird just happened there. I think doing a little bit of a wince, a little bit of a scrunching, intensifying that closure and then coming into the open eyes is a great idea. I just think this is, I think you kind of outsmarted yourself a little bit with some animation that was going in slightly different directions. And then right in here, as she's saying this moment, she kind of looks up, and there's not too much going on. And I realize, I think, that you probably want to make sure the audience has a chance to notice this. So we don't want, the audience can only look at one place at a time. And they're going to be kind of going back and forth between these two zones of interest. But at this moment, we want to see what's going on with his eyes. But even still, I think for her to be in this thoughtful moment...
You won't tell him, will you?
You won't tell him, will you? I think she would be looking at kind of at nothing but something a little bit away from her. And there'd probably be a couple little eye darts as she's like, oh, what's he going to do? Subtle eye darts. I also think the eye direction is a little off. This eye, here's the edges of the eye. This is at about the 1/3 point toward the nose. That's 1/3 looking out. This eye is turned way in. And so her screen left eye feels a little bit crossed relative to the screen right eye. Not too dramatically, but when we see all this white space there and just a tiny bit of white space there, we generally, if it's possible, you want to kind of replicate that on the other side. And I think bumping this eye over a little bit so that you just have a little sliver of the white of the other eye over there, and you're probably going to get a tiny bit of a sliver of white of the eye there. It's going to feel like she's not looking at something that's like right here, but she's going to be looking at something, 5 feet away, or looking at nothing. But even when we're staring off into space and not focused, we're kind of fixating on a spot. Not kind of, we are. And when we look at nothing in particular, our eyes kind of relax and they lose their convergence. There's a degree of convergence here that feels wrong on this eye. In addition to the little subtle stuff with the lids. I think this is really nice, like when she lifts her eyes up and you move the lids with that. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that really pays off. Our lids are very sensitive to our eye movements, and that's a place a lot of people miss. So that's great. I think you just could have added 1 or 2 little eye darts for her there as she's kind of, thinking. That would have given you 1 or 2 more chances to show that off.
I don't know.
Here, as she looks down, at this moment, it's really hard for a human being to move their head and move their eyes like a doll, where the head and the eyes move together. We really can't do that unless we're unconscious and our eyelids are somehow open. Even, when we're moving our head, we're still doing fixation points on our saccades, on our eye movements. And so, when somebody does this move and they kind of look down and blink and go, they do that. They look down. The eyes don't track down with the head. The only way you can have that kind of really smooth eye movement is if you're watching something come down. So when she goes from this pose here, where she's looking out, to this pose here, where she's tilted her nose down and now she's kind of looking over here, so we have that fairly significant change of eye direction, but there's no eye dart with it, that nothing happened. What I would recommend doing is, starting at about frame 89 or 90, do like a 2-frame eye dart where she goes from this eye direction to looking downward here. Drop the lid with that eye dart, so that gets you to there, and then keep that fixation point into the blink, and then close the eyes, and then come out of it. Then I think you would be fine. And I think you could probably, on the same note as I gave a moment ago, kind of matching up the white space on the eyes, unless we're looking at stuff really close, I think you could probably bump this eye over a little bit. So you end up with this eye pose where there is a little sliver of white there and a small amount of white there and a lot of white space there and a lot of white space there. And you could potentially even push it further. You can usually push this further than most people realize. And you have to push it because almost every CG rig I've ever used, if you just use the eye target and move it around, because the eyes in these rigs are huge compared to the head, they don't behave properly. All right, so even if you're, when somebody's savvy enough to go, yes, I'm going to use the eye target because that's really how our visual system works, and I'm going to pull it over there, and it's like one eye, this eye is kind of in the middle of the socket, and this eye is buried into the nose on most CG rigs. But you don't see that in real human beings, and so we have to hit our eye pose and then kind of move one eye individually to get the effect we want. So I think that it would probably be a more pleasing pose. And you could even, on top of that, lower the eye direction down and drop her eyelids with that. I wish I had skin tone to kind of draw this. But I think if you had her, as opposed to, kind of looking like that, looking down in a way, I think it would make her feel a little more guilty, a little more worried, a little more pensive. Whenever I do those drawovers like that, and then I go back to the way things are, it always really kind of jumps out at me. Like, yeah, those eyes aren't quite looking at the same thing. Hopefully, it's equally clear on your end.
I'm going to have to.
And I think you probably could have, you've got a little eye dart there. I wouldn't hesitate to stick in one or two more. I mean, the more angry someone is, the more calm they are, the more they just lock on. Blink rate goes down. When you're calm, you might blink a lot, or just a normal rate. But when you're angry, it's like, I'm not going to blink. I'm not doing these little fussy eye darts. It's that Michael Caine thing that he likes to talk about, or used to like to talk about. But when somebody's thoughtful, when they're worried, when they're not feeling good, what's going to happen, the eyes get really active, and people blink more, and they look in a lot of different directions, and they have a lot of little bitty eye darts. And so the contrast between him, not blinking as much and just having one or two thoughtful eye darts, and her kind of doing that kind of stuff, I think would have increased the contrast and the tension at this moment.
I'm going to have to think about this.
I think as he plunges his face into hers right here, I don't think it's possible that somebody could do that, come shoving their face right into yours, kind of coming from behind you and around, and not have you blink. I think it's the kind of natural reflexive blink that would be invisible. Sometimes we edit out our blinks in our animation because when you loop it through, it's like, why is that character blinking 4 times in this scene? And you end up with shots where nobody blinks. Which you're clearly not doing. But I think this is a case where that would be an almost natural blink, or not almost natural. It would be an almost invisible blink because it would be so natural. He comes swooping in. She blinks. It's almost like it's like, oh, kind of snapping out of her thoughtfulness, and reflexively. I mean, we just can't not blink when something comes up in the side of our peripheral vision. I think we've all had cases where that's protected our eye from being scratched or being poked or something. And sometimes there's a little subtle wince with it, a little pulling away. But at the very least, I think this big, fast move he does is he comes in on her like that. I would have tried putting a blink in there. And maybe you did. Maybe it looked too busy, and you edited it out. But I think it would be a nice touch.
I'm going to have to think about it.
Okay, so I like all this, all the scrunching up of her face, the way he's kind of grinding in there. I think you're really like this is all this lower lid. I think it's one thing for this eye to be kind of pushed up like that. That's great. I would have just let this be a little more of a natural close. It just feels like something external is pushing this part of her eyelid up, and it doesn't quite feel real. I would also, on that note about eye poses, you know, when she's looking way over at him, you know, I'd probably push this one over a little bit more. Let's see what that looks like real quick. I don't know. I think that makes a little more sense to me. That looks like she's really looking at the side of her eyes. So, yeah, just to really, I think it's an important note. On almost every CG rig, when characters are looking extreme left or extreme right, you end up having to really push one eye around a lot. And it's one of the most common mistakes I see made in even high-end CG feature films. It's just eye direction mistakes, eyelid mistakes, and they're generally subtle, but no sense not getting it right.
To think about it.
Okay, so I talked about when he pulls away, I would have liked to have, you know, it would have been nice if he was kind of pushing her, and as he pulls away, she kind of released a little bit. It's sort of like he wasn't really touching her. The way as he comes off of her face, she makes no change at all. I think there's probably some chances in there when he squeezes her in. I think he probably could have rolled his hand around a little more and really kind of let us feel him squeezing her deltoid, pushing her clavicles in, and then as he comes off it and she drops her clavicles a little bit, relaxing it. You know, there's just playing with the idea that this guy's got a little bit of a sadistic streak in him, and he's enjoying that she's in distress.
But you'll find out one way or the other.
So this is really the moment that confused me the most the first time I saw it. Is she's clearly expressed like, I don't want to be around you. This is gross. You're awful. And then he pulls away and she turns towards him and puts her hand on his chest. And it's not like she's, and maybe off screen like he's spinning her around, but it doesn't feel like it. Like if his left arm came up, like as he did this, if we felt, and you're probably in too tight to really sell this, but if this arm came up and kind of reached, reached across here, and he went from squeezing her this way to pulling back and grabbed her shoulder and pulled her into him, pulled her around this way to him. I think that would have made sense. But this feels more like she's almost reflexively like, I feel bad, hug me, even though you're the source of my distress. I think you could have sold that idea, but I just don't see any change in her face. She's kind of in the same facial expression all through here. So I don't see the thinking going on. I also, again, see that thing I talked about before, where her eyelids are moving up and down together without anything else happening. And it's subtle, but there's a little bit of a driftiness to it. It drifts up right there, and then it comes down, and it's kind of impossible to do that without something pushing them around. So, or unless, without the pressure on the face. So I think when he comes off her face, I think you could have changed her, the eyelid pose then, and then just, I don't know what kind of expression would sell the idea that she's ambivalent. Probably what I would have tried, maybe it wouldn't work, maybe it would stink, but as he pulls back and she turned, I probably would have, starting about here, opened her eyes and have her come around and look up at him, put that hand on the chest, kind of look up like, you're not really such an awful guy, are you? I didn't make that big a mistake. So I think this is a really nice tender gesture, putting the hand there. And I think if she had come up, and of course it doesn't help that she's got her hair in her eyes, but if she had kind of lifted her head up a little bit and just kind of given that little girl look, like I'm just trying, that like maybe she can make the puppy dog eyes at him, and then he kind of spins her a little bit and leans in and, shows in his expression that he really is an asshole. Then she could have, gone out of that look and pulled and kind of done a wince and pulled into this pose. I think that would have made the performance make sense to me overall. Maybe try that and didn't work. It's just, this is a long time. She closes her eyes at frame 152 or so, and her eyes are closed until 275. So it's a major chunk of this that she's kind of off the acting radar screen in the scene.
But you'll find out one way or the other.
And I think if she had looked up at him and he's like, he wants to make his point, and then she's like, oh no, and he's like, yes, you're going to listen to me and look at me, and then he, did this thing where he grabs her chin and pulls him towards her. I think it would have made that move even more powerful. It would have made it even more effective. So, it's often not the actual move, the actual gesture, the actual piece of animation that is really effective. It's how we set it up, and the anticipation or the counter move that came before it that like completely sells it. So maybe a missed opportunity there. I mean, and I could be wrong, but I would be curious to see how the shot would look with that adjustment.
One way or the other.
You won't tell him, will you?
And then, after having her eyes open right in this section and closing them, he makes her open them. I would then try, as he comes in here and kind of slams into her, just really squint her eyes closed. And then play with the idea like, like, no, oh, but you're such a good kisser, and then you do this little relax, and then it's like, you leave the audience like, holy cow, what is going on here? But it would have a feeling of emotional authenticity. Dysfunctional authenticity. It's like these are two mixed up, messed up people, but it would feel of a piece. And right now, I think the way it is he feels kind of sadistic and like a real jerk, and she, I'm not quite sure, is she a participant in that? This a victim? I think she needs to be drawn a little more sharply. Okay? I really like the little stuff you're doing with the hands that are barely seen. I think, except for, giving a little more of a kind of crushing of her, or squeezing of her deltoid when he's like controlling her. I think you've done a really nice job of not overselling the hands, but making them a part of this. It's easy to overdo hands. Hands are super important, but they don't need to be super broad. And so that's a really good job on that. All right, I think that's about it. All right, got a little bit longer than I meant to, but hopefully it's useful. It's good interacting with you again. Hope things are going great for you in New York. and maybe we'll hang out again sometime. Take care. I'll see you around.